Hello, today I will be discussing and reviewing Chapter 10 of our textbook, Conflict and Negotiating. Just a little background, I chose this chapter because experiencing conflict and negotiating is something that, we deal with every single day, and so I could really relate to the material, and I was excited to kind of learn about it, and I hope that you guys are too. So I'll try to remember to have you guys follow along on the PowerPoint as I'm talking. So we'll start with slide 1. I put a quote there: conflict is an inevitable result of interdependencies among people, work groups, and organizations. Given that all organizations are interdependent systems, organizations without conflict don't exist. Although many people feel that conflict can be destructive, in fact, a lot of conflict can be beneficial and desirable. Conflict can lead to employees, leaving an organization, but in the long run, conflict can also lead to positive outcomes such as better decisions, more motivated employees, and happier customers. When it's well managed, conflict can improve problem solving and innovation. It can increase employee involvement and commitment and can clarify work processes and goals. How conflict is managed is the biggest determinant of whether a conflict has positive or negative outcomes. We'll learn a lot today about negotiation, and that's an important skill in managing and resolving conflicts. I'll have you move to the next slide. So what is conflict? Conflict is described as a disagreement that arises when two or more parties perceive a threat to their interests, needs, or concerns. Like I said before, it can be both constructive and destructive. Whether it's positive or negative is determined by our response to the conflict rather than by the conflict in itself. Behaviors that escalate a conflict until the conflict seems to take on a life of its own generate what's called dysfunctional conflict. Dysfunctional conflict focuses on emotions and differences between two parties and can degenerate to the extent that the parties forget, what the conflict even is about, and their focus goes more on getting even, retaliating, or even hurting the other party. Not only can this type of conflict negatively influence an employee, work group, and company, but it also can lead to employee depression, absenteeism, turnover, burnout, and negative emotional states. At the same time, conflict can be positive. When it's effectively managed, conflict can be healthy. Interpersonal conflict can lead to greater learning, flexibility, and creativity. Behaviors that are adaptive and responsive to the situation, person, and issues create what's called constructive conflict. This type of conflict balances the interests of both parties to maximize mutual gains and the attainment of mutual goals. This type of conflict contains elements of creativity, adaptation, and a desire to discover a mutually acceptable outcome. It can lead to the identification of new alternatives and ideas. Constructive conflict is a natural, inevitable, and creative force and can be beneficial to employees and their organization. Have you go to slide 3. What creates conflict? The short and simple answer is that conflict can be caused by anything that leads to a disagreement. Task conflict is a disagreement about tasks or goals. Task conflict can be productive if it's handled correctly. Even when we agree about what we're trying to accomplish, we can still disagree about how we should accomplish it. And that kind of leads into what process conflict is. It reflects conflicts about how to accomplish a task, who is responsible for what, or how things should be delegated. Conflicts can arise from interpersonal differences in motivation, aspirations, or personality. Interpersonal differences are a common trigger of relationship conflict, which is a result of incompatibility or differences between individuals or groups. This type of conflict can also be triggered by personality, particularly the personality traits such as power motivation. It's consistently recognized as a primary source of stress for employees of all ages, cultures, and occupations. A statistic that I pulled from the book that I thought was really just interesting was 25% of employees from a wide range of occupations identified that interpersonal issues are the most stressing things at work. The availability of resources is a major source of conflict in organizations as well. A lot of problems can arise when trying to disperse limited resources because it turns into a zero-sum game in which one party's gain is the other party's loss. Change also causes conflict. it's been said that change is not possible without conflict. One of the primary drivers of conflict is just that uncertainty, and poor communication can increase uncertainty, and then that can increase the potential for conflict as well. People differ in their values and their worldviews. These differences are the source of value conflict, or conflict arising from perceived or actual incompatibilities in beliefs about what is good, what is bad, what's right or wrong, or what's fair and unfair. Information conflict occurs when people lack important information. They're misinformed, they interpret things differently, or disagree about what information is relevant. Task interdependence is when one person or unit is dependent on another for resources or information, so that in turn makes the potential for conflict increase. Structural conflict is the result of structural or process features of the organization. This type of conflict can be what's called horizontal or vertical. Horizontal occurs between groups at the same organization levels, such as between line and staff employees, or between departments like production and marketing. Vertical conflict occurs across different hierarchical levels in the organization, such as conflicts over wage issues or control. Have you go to the next slide. We're gonna move towards like conflict escalation. This happens when one party involved in a conflict first uses an aggressive tactic or begins using more aggressive tactics than the other party involved. When constructive approaches to conflict resolution don't work, or they break down, the conflict will escalate. The farther the conflict escalates, the more difficult it is to reverse that conflict, and more likely it is to become dysfunctional. In the first stage of conflict escalation, hardening, each side's opinion hardens, and the two opponents adopt what's called a collision course. The disagreement is recognized, but each side believes that the issue can be resolved through discussion or communication. The second stage, debate, each side's opinion becomes polarized and emotions rise. Each side begins thinking in terms of like black and white, and they adopt a viewpoint of themselves being more superior. Constructive conflicts are generally resolved by the second stage. The third stage, action over words, sees a decrease in empathy for the opponent, and the idea that talking no longer helps emerges. The conflict becomes increasingly destructive in this stage. In the fourth stage, images in coalitions, negative rumors are spread and stereotypes are formed as each side prepares for a fight and conducts a search for supporters. The fifth stage, loss of faith, marks the beginning of open and direct aggression intended to cause opponent's loss. In the sixth stage, threat as a strategy, threats and counter-threats increase. As ultimatums are made, conflict escalation accelerates. In the seventh stage, limited attempts to overthrow. The opponent is no longer viewed as a person. Slight personal damage can be considered acceptable at this stage as a consequence, as attempts to get to the opponent. In the eighth stage, fragmentation of the enemy, the goal becomes just getting at the other person in the destruction and dissolution of the system. This goal is pursued aggressively. The ninth and final stage, called Together into the Abyss, sees the descent into total confrontation with absolutely no way back. So that's kind of how things escalate. So to learn how to escalate them, that's kind of the process that happens. But to also, once you're experiencing that conflict and, it starts to escalate, it's always good to know de-escalation as well. And that's on our next slide. And so things to do to de-escalate conflict or a situation: be an empathetic listener, focus your attention on the other person, use delay tactics to create time to diffuse emotions, remind both parties that a win-win solution can be found, remember to stay focused on issues and not emotions, avoid communicating hostilely, verbally, or through body language, rejecting requests from the start, challenging, threatening, or daring, raising your voice, blaming either party, or saying anything that could cause the parties to lose face, and minimizing the situation or the conflict. So we'll have you switch to the next slide. So we've talked a lot about emotion and how that plays into conflict. Conflict can make us emotionally charged. It's often not recognized until we're recognizing that we are feeling that emotion or that we have felt something, and that's how we know that there's conflict. Our emotions can really influence how we can deal with conflict. Being able to control our emotions helps prevent that escalation of conflict. And also, it's always important to remember that assessing and acknowledging the emotions of the other party helps more effectively manage the conflict. I'll have you switch to the next slide. In the next slide, we're going to talk about interpersonal conflict management strategies. So the first one, collaborating, it reflects a high concern for your own interests and a high concern for the interests of the other party. This style emphasizes problem solving and pursues an outcome that gives both parties what they want. It helps to build commitment to the outcome, although the communication required to reach a solution can take a lot of time and energy. It creates a lot of trust and openness. This is generally regarded as the best approach for managing in most conflicts. Another one is compromising. This is one in which each side sacrifices something in order to end the conflict. It's been seen as like a middle ground style. It reflects a moderate concern for your own interests and moderate concerns for the interests of the other party. The goal of compromising is that I win some and lose some, you win some and lose some. Competing is a conflict management style, and this is high concern for your own interests and low concern for the other party. This approach is generally used when the conflict issue is important or to set an example. However, because one party is trying to dominate the other, this management style can escalate the conflict and the other person maybe will want to retaliate. Accommodating is a cooperative conflict management style. It reflects a low concern for your own interests and a high concern for the interests of the other party. It's generally used when the issue is more important to the other person than it is to you. Avoiding is a passive conflict style involving ignoring the conflict or, in fact, denying that it exists. This style reflects a low concern for your own interests and a low concern for your interests of the other party. The primary drawback to an avoidance style is that the decision may not be the best for you or what's in your best interests. The next slide just kind of breaks down the conflict process. I wanted to remake a graph that I had found in the book, and this kind of just shows everything that we're talking about and puts it in a step-by-step process that's a little easier to follow along. If you go to the next slide after that, conflict management skills. So there's a lot of necessary skills for effective conflict management. Professionals in conflict resolution have suggested 4 areas of skill development. That's listening, questioning, communicating, and mediating. Mediating involves a lot of open-mindedness, staying non-judgmental and calm, demonstrating empathy and sensitivity, remaining neutral, respecting confidentiality, and showing flexibility and resilience. And then I'll talk about creating constructive conflict. To successfully create this type of conflict, organizations often punish conflict avoiders. Rewarding employees who engage in constructive conflict can help reduce employees' fears of, ridicule or rejection. A simple thank you can signal to employees that it's okay to speak up. Hiring employees who are comfortable with constructive conflict and who tend to use effective conflict management strategies can also enhance this type of conflict and improve performance at your organization. Assigning one or more employees to play the role of devil's advocate can help to generate this type of conflict as well by providing a safe environment for the introduction of different type of perspectives. We'll go to the slide about negotiation. I've touched base on this right at the beginning, but at some time or another, everyone has to negotiate. Negotiation is a process in which 2 or more parties make offers, counteroffers, and concessions in order to reach an agreement. Most managers do a lot of negotiating as part of their jobs. There are 2 types of negotiation, distributive and integrative. Distributive occurs under zero-sum conditions where any gain to one party is offset by an equivalent loss to the other. Essentially, it distributes resources among the parties involved. This is more of like a win-lose way. It tends to be competitive and adversarial. Integrative negotiation is more of a win-win negotiation in which the agreement involves no loss to either party. This is seen as a better bargaining than distributive because neither party feels that they've lost. To be able to negotiate, we must first know how to be able to negotiate effectively. Some suggestions for being an effective negotiator: don't look at a deal as an either-or proposition. Negotiating is all about compromise. Make sure each side knows the other's perspective. Identify what you can and cannot part with. Try to identify and use sources of leverage. Help the other person to see you as an ally by mirroring their emotions. Be able to suppress your own emotions, and remember the acronym BATNA, which stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. Wanted to touch base a little bit about cultural issues in negotiation. Different national cultures have different preferred negotiation styles. When people believe that they've been treated disrespectfully in negotiation as a result of just having different cultural views or norms, that can just make the entire negotiation go south or the conflict escalate. So the main thing to remember in this, when you're working with different cultural issues in negotiation, is just remember to kind of do like your background homework and find what's appropriate for the culture that you're negotiating with and things like that. We'll move to the next slide. Sometimes two individuals or parties, they're unable to reach a settlement through direct negotiations with each other. In these cases, they may involve a third party to overcome the situation. This process is called alternative dispute resolution. There are 3 types of this. It's conciliation. A third party builds a positive relationship between the parties, improves their communication, and facilitates discussion. The second is mediation, and that's an impartial third party facilitates a discussion using persuasion and logic, suggesting alternatives and establishing each side's priorities. The third is the mediator, the third is arbitration. That's where a third party is involved and usually has the authority to impose a settlement on the parties. So now we'll move to the last slide where that kind of just shows my question there for you. And so I want you to think of a time that you had a conflict in the workplace. How did you handle it? Do you believe you handled it well? Or now with the information that you've learned about conflict and negotiation, how could you have handled it differently? Thank you.